Emma had always been skeptical of ghost stories and haunted houses, which is why when she and her brother inherited the old Victorian house on the edge of town, a place that locals whispered about for decades and insisted had been abandoned for years, she laughed off their warnings and stepped inside without a second thought. But the moment her foot crossed the threshold, the air changed. It was thick, heavy, almost tangible, as if the walls themselves were alive, exhaling faint whispers she couldn't quite hear but felt crawling under her skin. The house smelled of dust, decay, and something faintly metallic, and every creak of the floorboards sounded louder than it should, echoing like footsteps that weren't hers. Determined to prove to herself and to anyone who might question her that the place was empty, Emma unpacked a series of cameras she had brought with her, positioning them strategically in the living room, hallways, and even the upstairs bedrooms, intending to capture any signs of wildlife or settling wood that might explain the strange sounds. The first night passed slowly, the hours stretching in endless silence, until around 2:13 a.m., when a flicker on one of the monitors caught her eye. A shadow, tall and impossibly thin, moving against the flow of moonlight streaming through the living room windows. She froze, staring at the screen, her heartbeat quickening, telling herself it had to be a trick of light, a reflection, anything rational. But the shadow moved again, bending and twisting in ways that no human body could, hovering slightly above the floor as if floating. And then, in the corner of her eye, she thought she saw the same darkness shift in the hallway beyond the living room, subtle and deliberate, and it felt aware. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was exhaustion, imagination running wild in the stillness of a house that hadn't been lived in for decades. Yet a cold chill crept down her spine, crawling through her bones in a way that made her skin prickle and her fingers tremble. Over the next few hours, the footage became increasingly strange. The shadow lingered in the same spots no matter how she moved, its movements synchronized with the creaks and groans of the floor, as if it was deliberately testing the boundaries of the house. And Emma realized with rising horror that the entity was not only moving, but observing her. Her brother, asleep in the adjoining room, remained oblivious, and part of her was terrified to wake him, fearing what might happen if both of them were conscious witnesses to whatever was stalking the house. Emma's hands shook as she rewound the footage frame by frame. There were moments the shadow appeared in places where she knew she had locked doors, others where it seemed to bend around corners impossibly, appearing in multiple rooms almost simultaneously, and once, for just a fleeting second, it leaned toward the camera as if acknowledging that it had been watched. Her stomach churned, a wave of nausea hitting her, and she felt her own heartbeat echo in her ears, loud and frantic, because the realization settled cold in her mind. This house wasn't abandoned. It had never been empty. The cameras had been nothing more than observers, silently recording the presence that had waited, patient, for someone to enter. And she knew then that the true terror wasn't what the shadow could do. It was that it had been waiting for them all along, watching and learning, and the footage would forever prove that what they had been told about this house was a lie. And as the night deepened, the shadows stretched and twisted along the walls, forming impossible angles, the silence broken only by the occasional scrape or creak that had no origin, leaving Emma paralyzed with fear, knowing she was not alone, knowing that every corner of the house concealed something sentient calculating and unseen. And as the clock ticked toward the next hour, she understood one horrifying truth. The house had its own rules, its own guardians, and the cameras had just shown her the beginning of a nightmare that had only just begun. The second night in the house brought an even deeper sense of dread that settled over Emma like a suffocating blanket. And no matter how she tried to convince herself that the strange noises and flickering shadows were simply the result of the old wood contracting, or the wind rattling through broken panes, her instincts screamed otherwise. She paced the hallways with a flashlight in one hand and her phone in the other, trying to track the source of every groan, whisper, and faint thump. But every time she paused, the feeling of being watched intensified, pressing against her chest like invisible hands. And she could swear she saw figures move just beyond the edges of the light, bending at unnatural angles, disappearing when she blinked, leaving only the faintest disturbance in the shadows. Determined to capture proof, she checked the cameras she had set up the previous night, heart pounding as she reviewed the footage, and what she saw made her stomach drop on the living room camera. The tall, faceless shadow appeared again, hovering slightly above the floor as if it had no need for gravity, its head tilting at an impossible angle, moving slowly toward the hallway, pausing just long enough for her to feel that it had sensed her presence. She froze, watching in disbelief as the entity glided silently through the frame, its form stretching and bending in ways that should have been physically impossible. And then for a fraction of a second, it seemed to lean toward the camera as if studying not just her movements, but the very device she used to observe it, testing the boundary between watcher and watched. Emma's brother, still asleep, remained blissfully unaware, snoring softly as though nothing unusual was happening, and a part of her wanted to wake him to share the horror, but another part feared that waking him would provoke the entity in ways she couldn't predict. The more she watched, the more the pattern became clear. The shadow appeared in rooms before she entered them, vanished from cameras when she looked directly, and sometimes split into smaller, wisp-like forms that moved independently, all converging again into one towering figure in the corners of her vision, as if the house itself were conducting a deliberate, patient experiment, orchestrating fear. When she traced the footage from the staircase camera, she nearly screamed. The shadow floated down the stairs, limbs bending in ways no human could, pausing at the bottom to tilt its head in her direction. And then it turned its invisible gaze toward the hall where she had just been, moving backward through space as though rewinding reality, a force defying the laws of physics, yet every movement was deliberate, intelligent, and unnervingly calm. Emma's hands shook, her breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts, because she understood that this was not a random haunting, not a trick of old boards or flickering lights. The house had never been empty. It had been alive, patient, sentient, and it was using the cameras not to hide from her, but to communicate, to assert presence, to teach her that they were intruders in a space that obeyed rules they could not comprehend. Hours passed, the darkness thickened, and even when she dared to look away from the monitors, the sensation of being watched persisted, brushing against her skin, whispering along her nerves. And as the first pale hints of dawn began to filter through the grimy windows, Emma realized with icy certainty that the night had only been a rehearsal. The house, the shadows, the faceless entity they had been observing, learning, and waiting for the moment when Emma and her brother could no longer deny the truth. A truth captured in every camera frame, every whisper of movement, and every unnatural bend of light and shadow, leaving her to face the horrifying realization that no one would believe them, and the house would continue to claim its presence, invisible yet unmistakable, until it had them completely in its grasp. By the third night, Emma's fear had become a constant companion, a living weight pressing against her chest as she moved silently through the darkened hallways, flashlight trembling in her hand, each beam of light trembling against walls that seemed to shift ever so slightly when she wasn't looking, and she knew her brother's attempts to dismiss the events as imagination or exhaustion were no longer comforting, because the cameras never lied, and the footage had escalated to a level she could no longer rationalize. She watched, frozen, as the living room camera showed the faceless shadow gliding with impossible speed from corner to corner, bending its limbs and tilting its head at angles that made her stomach twist in knots. And for the first time, she noticed something even more terrifying. It appeared to respond directly to her presence, not physically, but almost psychologically, pausing whenever she lingered too long in a hallway, its faceless form warping subtly as if communicating a silent, mocking awareness. The bedroom cameras revealed movements that made her blood run cold. Doors that she had double-locked creaked open slowly. Floors groaned under invisible weight, and faint, ghostly shapes flickered in corners that should have been empty. all converging toward the camera as if they knew they were being recorded, twisting the very angles of the room in ways that should have been impossible. Emma tried to steady her breathing, telling herself that it was a dream, a hallucination, anything to keep her mind from unraveling. But when she glanced at the footage from the attic camera, she almost screamed. Multiple faceless forms, some taller, darker, and more distorted than the original, glided silently across the floorboards, bending through walls and ceilings, their presence undeniable, deliberate, and malevolent. And one of them turned toward the lens, head tilting in that impossible, unnatural way, freezing Emma with a sense of recognition, as if it knew her deepest fears and intended to exploit them. Her brother stirred in his sleep, mumbling incoherently, and a sudden creak from above made Emma spin her flashlight toward the ceiling, catching only the faintest shimmer of movement before it vanished, leaving her with a primal understanding. The house was not only alive, it was aware of them, aware of the cameras, and aware that they were watching. Panic rose in her chest as the figures began appearing simultaneously on multiple monitors, their synchronized movements suggesting intelligence, coordination, and intent, and a low, almost imperceptible vibration seemed to emanate from the very walls, resonating through her bones as if the house itself were breathing in tandem with the shadowy beings it had harbored for decades. She stumbled backward, tripping over a loose floorboard, and as she scrambled to regain composure, the cameras revealed the most horrifying sight yet. The faceless figure hovering above her brother's sleeping form, limbs bending impossibly as it loomed, tilting its head toward Emma as if assessing her reaction, testing her. And in that moment, she realized with a cold certainty that the house had chosen its prey, and that choice was them. The cameras had become witnesses, documenting every moment, yet powerless to intervene, capturing the terrifying truth that no door, no lock, no attempt at rational explanation could shield them from the presence that had existed in the shadows long before they arrived, and would continue to exist long after they fled, unless, of course, the house decided otherwise. By the fourth night, Emma's exhaustion had reached a breaking point, but she could not ignore the relentless terror that had taken root in every corner of the house. She set up even more cameras, including one in the attic and another aimed directly at the staircase, hoping to capture evidence that would explain or at least rationalize the events, yet the footage revealed horrors beyond anything she could have imagined. Shadows moved independently of light, stretching and twisting across walls in impossible angles, while the faceless figures she had first seen appeared again, this time accompanied by smaller wispy forms that darted through doorways and floors as though the house itself were bending reality to accommodate them. Her heart pounded as she watched the living room monitor. The tall, thin entity hovered above the floor, head cocked unnaturally to the side, moving with deliberate curiosity as if it were studying not only them but the very instruments used to observe it, bending toward the camera in a way that suggested awareness of their scrutiny. Emma's brother stirred in his sleep, whispering incoherently, and a cold chill crawled up her spine when the hallway camera captured a faint shimmer of movement near the ceiling where no one could possibly stand, yet the shadow shifted in a way that mirrored her own movements almost mockingly, as though it was testing her, learning her patterns. The attic footage revealed the most terrifying discovery: a congregation of faceless forms, some larger and more distorted than the original, circling, slowly moving with silent purpose, performing a ritual no human mind could comprehend, and every slight motion felt purposeful, intelligent, and predatory, as if the house itself had awakened and now orchestrated their fear with precise timing. Emma's hands shook as she rewound the footage, repeatedly noticing subtle details she had missed. The shadows bent and stretched around corners in ways that defied logic, appearing in multiple rooms simultaneously, and the air in the house seemed to vibrate with a low, resonant hum, a sound that pressed against her chest and made her teeth ache as if the walls themselves were alive. Panic and dread surged through her as she realized that the entity had adapted, no longer content to merely appear in the cameras. It was interacting. probing, observing their every reaction, bending reality to ensure they felt its presence. And in one frame, the tallest figure paused at the top of the staircase, head tilting unnaturally, as if acknowledging Emma directly, a silent, malevolent greeting that left her gasping. She wanted to flee, to escape into the night, but a crushing sensation rooted her to the spot, and she understood, with the horror of inevitability, that the house had claimed them. The cameras had captured everything, yet they were powerless witnesses to the entity's will. And when the first pale light of dawn barely touched the edges of the grimy windows, Emma knew the nightmare would not end. The shadows, the faceless forms, and the sentient presence in the walls had learned, observed, and were waiting, and the house would continue to play its cruel game every night, ensuring that no one would ever truly leave its grasp. By the fifth night, Emma could barely distinguish reality from the nightmare the house had woven around them, and every creak, whisper, and flicker of shadow seemed amplified, echoing with a life of its own, as if the walls themselves were aware of her fear. She wandered the darkened hallways with a handheld camera, determined to confront the unknown, though each step made her pulse race and her chest tighten, for the house had a rhythm, a sinister cadence that she now felt in every floorboard beneath her feet. The living room camera captured a sight that made her heart nearly stop. The faceless figure stood near the corner, its elongated limbs bent at impossible angles, swaying slightly as though breathing in tandem with the house itself. And for the first time it moved toward the camera, directly defying space, bending around furniture, sliding through walls as if gravity and reality no longer applied. Emma's hands shook as she raised her flashlight, trying to illuminate the being, but the light only made the shadows stretch and warp unnaturally, forming grotesque shapes on the walls, corners, and ceiling. Shapes that twisted toward her, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed as though the entity had multiplied. Dozens of faceless forms flickering in and out of the footage, hovering, crawling, and bending in ways no human body could replicate. She heard her brother stir in the bedroom, mumbling in terror, but when she glanced toward him, he was still asleep, or perhaps paralyzed by fear she could not see, while the attic camera showed movement above them, a faint shimmer that bent light itself, and Emma realized the horrifying truth. The house was no longer simply haunted. It was alive, aware, and feeding on their fear, orchestrating each movement to maximize terror. Every step she took, every door she opened, every glance at the monitors revealed that the faceless figure was learning, adapting, and responding. The camera in the kitchen caught it gliding silently across the floor, limbs elongating, tilting its head as if mocking her panic, while smaller shadow forms darted along the walls and ceiling, moving with calculated precision. And the low hum began to vibrate through the floor, the walls, even the air, pressing against her body and her mind, a sensory assault that left her trembling and nauseated. Emma stumbled backward, nearly dropping the camera, and as she turned a corner, the entity appeared before her, impossibly fast, bending reality around it, tilting its head in that same unnatural manner, and for a heartbeat, it hovered silently, observing, before retreating into the dark hallway, leaving only the cameras to capture its presence. She ran to the monitors and reviewed the footage in disbelief, noting frames she hadn't seen live, the faceless forms appearing simultaneously in multiple rooms, their heads cocking in unison, moving as if part of one collective intelligence, aware of every reaction, every flicker of fear. And then, horrifyingly, the tallest figure paused in the doorway of her brother's room, its head tilting as if acknowledging her directly, and Emma understood that the house had claimed them, that the cameras were witnesses, and that no lock, no door, no attempt at rational thought could protect them from the sentient darkness that now moved freely among the wall's corners and shadows, a nightmare made flesh, or perhaps a nightmare that had always been waiting. By the sixth night, Emma's exhaustion had reached a point where fear and fatigue intertwined into a constant, suffocating presence. But she knew she had to keep observing, documenting, and understanding the entity that had claimed their inherited home, because the cameras were the only witnesses to the impossible truths she could no longer deny. As she reviewed the footage from every angle, a horrifying pattern emerged. The faceless figure and its smaller counterparts moved with deliberate intelligence, appearing and vanishing at will, bending through walls, crawling along ceilings, and lingering just long enough to make their presence undeniable. And every tilt of the head, every subtle movement, felt personalized, as if the house and its shadows were actively studying her, anticipating her reactions. That night, she carried a handheld camera into the basement, a place she had avoided until now, and immediately sensed a shift in the atmosphere. The air grew colder, thicker, vibrating faintly against her skin, and shadows gathered unnaturally in corners, forming shapes that defied comprehension, twisting as if they were alive. The footage revealed something far worse than she had imagined: multiple faceless entities circling each other in a silent, ritualistic pattern, their limbs contorting at impossible angles, and the largest figure, darker and more ominous than the others, paused in the center, tilting its head and seeming to regard the camera as if it were a fragile extension of her own consciousness, daring her to confront what she could not understand. Emma stumbled backward, heart hammering, breath caught in her throat, but curiosity and the need for proof kept her rooted in place. And then she saw it, the figures moving with uncanny synchronization, some appearing simultaneously on different cameras, bending reality so that hallways seemed longer, ceilings higher, floors uneven, and the house itself seemed to shift around them, a living, malevolent organism orchestrating their terror. She glanced at the attic camera, and her blood ran cold. The shadows hovered above the floor, tilting their heads in unison, almost mocking, almost beckoning, as if signaling that the house had a consciousness far older and more cunning than she could imagine, and that it considered her and her brother mere pawns in its endless game. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, yet when she moved toward the stairs, the footage revealed the largest figure gliding silently down the hall, bending impossibly around the corner, moving faster than any human could, tilting its head toward her as if acknowledging her defiance. And Emma realized with crushing horror that the house had observed their patterns, adapted to their presence, and that the cameras were no longer just documenting. They were part of the entity's plan, its extension, its means of control, and that escape would not be simple. The house had learned them, measured them, studied them, and the faceless figures had become more audacious, appearing without warning, twisting light and shadow to disorient, manipulate, and terrify, leaving Emma with the horrifying certainty that the night would never truly end, that every corner, shadow, and wall was a potential conduit for the entity's attention, and that no matter what they tried, the house and its sentient darkness had already claimed them as permanent residents of its nightmare, leaving only the cameras to bear silent witness to a horror that defied reason, comprehension, and the very laws of nature itself. By the seventh night, Emma's fear had transformed into a tense, paralyzing awareness, every step through the shadow-filled hallways feeling like a gamble against a presence that had grown smarter, more deliberate, and terrifyingly patient. And she could no longer ignore the fact that the house itself had become an active participant in their nightmare, warping reality around them in ways she couldn't comprehend. The cameras captured movements that defied physics, shadows stretching impossibly long, bending around corners, hovering above floors, and appearing simultaneously in multiple rooms, all while the largest faceless figure loomed, observing, tilting its head in silent recognition of their fear. That night, Emma armed herself with a handheld camera, walking slowly through the rooms as she whispered into the device, desperate to document evidence of what had been stalking them. And the living room monitor revealed a horrifying truth. The faceless entity wasn't alone. Dozens of smaller, shadowy forms emerged from every corner, their movements synchronized and deliberate, surrounding her as if performing a ritual, bending and twisting the very walls to create impossible angles, while the largest figure floated silently above them all, a dark sentinel that seemed to measure her courage and despair alike. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she noticed the shadows reacting to her movements, some darting closer when she paused, others retreating when she advanced, demonstrating an intelligence and awareness that made the house feel alive, sentient, and malevolent. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through broken windows seemed orchestrated to heighten her panic, and the cameras recorded each subtle motion, each unnatural bend of shadow, leaving her with the horrifying knowledge that they were being studied and toyed with. As she ascended the staircase toward the attic, the footage revealed a sight that stole the last remnants of her courage. The largest figure glided through walls effortlessly, tilting its head at her, and smaller shadows flowed behind it like dark smoke, each moving with precise coordination, all converging toward the attic door as if guiding her to a confrontation she could not avoid. Panic surged, but curiosity forced her forward, and as she opened the attic door, the camera captured a chilling scene. The faceless sentinel hovered in the center, surrounded by dozens of smaller shadows, forming a circle that pulsed with an unearthly rhythm, almost as if the house itself were breathing through them, communicating through movement. And in that moment, Emma understood that the house had claimed them fully. The shadows had studied every fear, every instinct, and that the cameras were not just observers. They were extensions of the entity's will, recording their terror while subtly manipulating it. She stumbled backward, her heart hammering, and realized that escape was no longer a question of doors or locks. The house, the shadows, and the faceless figure had become one, a living nightmare that adapted to her every move. And as the footage showed the entity tilting its head toward the camera once more, Emma's mind froze with the realization that their ordeal was only beginning, that the house's sentience would continue to orchestrate their fear night after night, and that anyone who dared enter or even watch the recordings would become part of the story, observed, studied, and claimed by the dark, intelligent presence that had always been waiting for them. By the 8th night, Emma felt as if the house had burrowed into her mind. Each shadow, creak, and whisper no longer merely external, but embedded deep in her thoughts, a constant reminder that the faceless figures were not just watching, they were learning, adapting, and orchestrating their terror with deliberate precision, and every monitor confirmed the horrifying reality. The house had grown sentient, using shadows as extensions of its will, bending reality itself to trap them in its domain. That night, she carried her handheld camera through the dimly lit hallways, trembling, while the largest faceless figure appeared again on multiple cameras simultaneously, tilting its head, moving impossibly, and drawing smaller shadowy forms toward her in slow, calculated waves, creating an atmosphere so heavy that the air itself seemed to resist her movements. In the living room, the camera captured shadows flowing across the floor as if they had liquid form, curling up walls, slipping through cracks, and forming impossible angles. And Emma realized with a shiver that the house wasn't just haunting them, it was testing them, marking their fear and shaping an experience tailored to their deepest insecurities. As she ascended to the attic, the camera footage revealed the shadows multiplying, bending light and space, and in the corner of her eye, she saw the largest figure hover in a way that defied all logic, its head tilting slowly, acknowledging her presence as though it understood her dread. The attic camera showed them circling, moving in a pattern that suggested purpose, their forms constantly shifting, some appearing partially transparent, others solid, all emanating a cold, oppressive awareness that pressed against Emma's mind, making every thought and heartbeat feel loud, amplified, and exposed. The whispers, soft, indecipherable, yet somehow understood, seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, pressing against her consciousness, and the largest figure's head tilt felt like a silent communication. You are here because we allow it, and there is no escape. Emma's breath caught as the shadows converged toward the center of the room, forming a vortex of darkness that pulsed in rhythm with the house's low, resonant hum, and she realized with crushing horror that the cameras had not been protecting them. They had been conduits, tools for the entity to measure, manipulate, and expand its influence. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the house seemed to stretch and shift, corridors elongating, ceilings bending, making escape feel impossible. The monitors displayed angles that didn't exist in reality, the shadows moving in perfect, coordinated synchronization, as if they were one conscious organism with an intent beyond human comprehension. Emma understood, finally, that the faceless entities were not simply spirits or manifestations. They were the house made flesh, its consciousness flowing through walls, floors, and corners, and the cameras were the only link between the human world and this sentient nightmare, silently recording the terror that would continue long after any mortal presence left or failed to leave. As the night deepened, the largest shadow leaned toward the camera, tilting its head in that impossible, deliberate way, and Emma felt a shiver of existential dread. The house had claimed them, observed them, and integrated them into its story, leaving her with a singular, horrifying certainty that some places are never truly empty, and that the cameras had only told half the story. The rest existed in the silent, watching darkness that now knew everything about them, their fear, their patterns, and the inevitability of the house's relentless grip. By the 9th night, Emma's mind was fraying under the relentless pressure of the house and its faceless sentient inhabitants. Every shadow and creak a calculated reminder that she and her brother were no longer in control. And the cameras, once her allies, had become extensions of the entity itself, silently recording their terror while simultaneously shaping it. She moved through the darkened hallways with trembling hands, clutching a handheld camera as the largest faceless figure appeared on multiple monitors at once, bending reality around it, limbs twisting impossibly, tilting its head in a way that suggested intelligence, awareness, and patience beyond comprehension. The smaller shadows darted and swirled, forming patterns that seemed ritualistic, surrounding her in the footage, creeping along walls and ceilings, yet leaving no trace in the physical space she navigated, creating a nightmarish environment that blurred the line between reality and the house's manipulation. As she ascended the staircase, the attic camera revealed the largest shadow hovering silently above the landing, head cocked in deliberate observation, while dozens of smaller shadows flowed like black smoke beneath it, bending the very dimensions of the hallway, elongating corners and curving ceilings to trap her vision and distort her sense of direction. Emma felt her heartbeat echo in her ears as she realized the house was no longer passive. It was anticipating her every move, feeding on her fear and recording it with the cameras that she had once relied upon for proof. She stumbled into the attic, where the largest figure waited, impossibly still yet radiating intent, and the smaller shadows circled like sentient smoke, pulsating with the rhythm of the house itself, pressing against her mind with whispers she couldn't fully comprehend, insinuating thoughts, memories, and fears she had never shared with anyone. The air felt viscous, heavy, vibrating faintly, pressing against her chest and skull, and Emma realized that the house was alive, conscious, and aware of every thought she had, bending reality, light, and shadow to make its presence undeniable. The faceless figures were its instruments, orchestrating a horror that defied logic, reason, and human comprehension. Every camera she checked showed new angles, new movements, impossible shapes that twisted and multiplied, confirming what her instincts already knew. The house had claimed them, adapted to them, and ensured that no escape would ever be simple or straightforward. And then, as she reviewed the footage of the attic one last time before dawn, the largest shadow leaned toward the camera with an unmistakable tilt of its head. And for a brief, frozen moment, Emma felt a wave of existential horror wash over her, an understanding that the house had integrated her fear, her very presence into its endless, observing consciousness, and the cameras had only told half the story. The rest existed in the silent, watching darkness, a nightmare that would persist, evolve, and continue to haunt anyone who dared enter, or even dare to bear witness, leaving her with the horrifying certainty that some places are never truly empty, and that in certain houses, darkness does not merely exist, it waits, watches, learns, and claims. As the first faint light of dawn filtered through the grimy windows, Emma realized with crushing clarity that the nightmare was far from over. The faceless figures had receded into the shadows for now, but their presence lingered in every corner, every hallway, every whisper of the house itself. And the cameras, silent witnesses to horrors beyond human understanding, had captured every impossible movement, every tilt of the head, every contorted shadow, leaving undeniable proof of what they had experienced, yet also serving as a haunting reminder that the house was alive, sentient, and eternally aware. Her brother remained asleep, oblivious to the fact that they had survived another night only because the entity allowed it, and Emma felt an icy realization settle deep in her bones. The house had claimed them. Their fear had been studied, measured, and stored within its walls, and anyone who entered after them would be drawn into the same relentless cycle. As she looked once more at the monitors, the shadows flickered faintly, bending in ways they shouldn't, forming impossible angles that whispered the same silent message. You can leave the rooms, but you cannot leave the house, and we will always be watching. Emma knew then that this was no ordinary haunting, no random trick of light and sound. This was an intelligence, a presence that existed beyond human comprehension, using the very structure of the house as a vessel to terrify, control, and observe. And as she took her first tentative steps toward the door, the house seemed to breathe around her, alive and patient, its unseen occupants waiting for the next moment, the next intruder, the next story to add to its endless, dark archive. And even as she finally crossed the threshold, the cameras captured one last flicker in the hallway, a tilt of a faceless head, an unmistakable acknowledgement that though she had left the house physically, the house had not released her. It had only recorded, learned, and continued to wait, leaving her with the chilling certainty that some horrors are permanent, some darkness never fades, and some houses are never truly empty. They are simply biding their time, watching, and patiently waiting for the next set of unwitting eyes to witness what lies within.